Hello composers and creators, it's Zach Heidi, and today I want to talk about creating a realistic mockup using cheap or even free VSTs. Now the reason I'm making this video is because sometimes when we hear music that we really love, particularly musical mockups, we tend to think that it's the VSTs that make it sound so good. Now I've fallen into this trap just as much as anybody else, and while it's true that good sample libraries will influence and improve your production, it's not the end all. I would say that 40% of a good production has to do with good arranging and orchestration skills, another 40% has to do with good programming skills, and maybe the last 20% has to do with good software. Now the subjects of arranging, orchestration, and production are enormous and can't get covered, of course, in one video, but what I thought we'd do today is kind of focus in on the programming side. I'm gonna take the stock Logic sounds, just a couple of orchestral sounds from their default library, and talk about some of the things you can do to improve the realism. These techniques are things that you could then apply to any other library, whether it's a free one or a purchased one. Learning to program virtual instruments is very similar to learning to play a musical instrument. It requires its own skill set, its own knowledge base, and being able to play these instruments fluidly, it's gonna make you feel like you're making music and not making computer program, and it's gonna enhance the realism of your mockups. So before we jump in, if you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like, it really helps me out. Subscribe for more videos like this, I upload once a week, and if you wanna support more content like this, be sure to check out my Patreon. Okay, so I'm here in Logic. I'm just gonna pull up a stock sound in Logic. So I'm gonna press Y to open the library. And once the library's open, I'm just gonna search for a violin. It's a good starting point. Let's pick violin section 1. Now, if I play that, let's see how it sounds right off the bat. Okay, it's not too bad. You know, we've got kind of a moderately realistic sound, but there's a couple things that are making it sound kind of flat and, you know, non-expressive. Now, the very first and probably the most important thing we need to understand about sampler instruments is that there are different samples, typically, for different volumes. Good sampler instruments and a lot of even free or cheap ones will have this. So when I'm playing this, I'm actually only playing one sample for each note, and that sample is usually the same dynamic. But if I press the note harder, you'll see we actually have a different sample playing. Here's the soft one, medium, and loud. They're not just louder and quieter, they're actually different. You notice the quiet one has a lot less vibrato, and the loud one has a lot more. That's really, really important. Just because you're influencing the volume of the track doesn't mean you're actually changing the sample. We have to use both the sample triggers, meaning the loud and soft samples, and the volume simultaneously to create a realistic sound. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just play this thing completely flat so you hear what it sounds like when we're not doing anything. Okay, now let's duplicate the track with Command D, and we're gonna take this MIDI, and let's see what we can do in the programming world to change it a little bit. The first thing I wanna do is adjust those samples like we talked about. So let's double click on it to open the piano roll. Let's press A to open automation, and if we go over to note velocity, it's on the bottom, you'll see we have our notes. This is how hard I actually press the notes. Now if we double click and drag, just to make a line, like a little arc, we can actually influence that a little bit. So now we kind of have like an arc where it swells up and then moves back down. Let's listen to that. Now already we have a little bit of a difference, right? We have a bit more digging in as it gets to the more climactic section of this little melody. But the problem we have now is even with the quiet notes, we don't have any decay or swelling within those notes. You listen, it's just kind of static, right? Just starts and then it stops. So now we need to influence the volume a little bit. Now there's many ways you can do this. I'm gonna show you the most basic way, which is using the track volume. If we take our little slider here for volume, we can drag this up and down and I can just imitate what that would sound like. Now the way I use volume typically is I don't have it exactly imitate the shape of the velocity or the samples, but pretty close. I especially want to exaggerate the entrances and exits because most sample libraries won't have a very good exit, so it'll just go duh and just stop. So we use volume to kind of ease that transition in and out. To be able to record this, I'm gonna go over to where it says read, and I'm gonna click latch. Now anything I do while the playhead is playing is going to be recorded. So let's go back a couple measures. Let's drag this volume down, and then let's kind of draw it as we go. All right, now we can see that because this isn't MIDI automation, it's track automation. If I go back to my arrange window and press A, you'll see that here is our volume that I just recorded. Now, very important, you wanna make sure you turn off latch and go back to read. If you keep latch on by mistake, it's gonna be recording everything you do when you press play, so be careful about that. Let's just zoom in and give it a listen. I think it's pretty good. Let's say I wanted that ending to be a little bit more exaggerated. Now I could just re-record it, or I could go inside my tools, click on the pencil tool, and right click and just kind of drag this down. So you can draw in all your automation if you'd like to. All right, maybe a little bit too much, a little bit less. Let's try that. Okay, now I don't love drawing in my automation because I find it harder to make it sound realistic. I like to play it in as much as I can, or, kind of drag those faders. But this is a way you can do it kind of for some surgical tweaks. Now again, there are other ways to influence the volume. You can do that in MIDI world, but I'm not gonna get into that. I could get into that in a different video. We're gonna keep this kind of concise and brief today. The next thing that we have that's kind of inhibiting our realism is the fact that with a violin or soloistic instruments, unlike a piano, they're typically gonna play one note at a time. Sometimes you'll use multiple notes for special effects like double or triple stops on a violin, where they're kind of just doing a quick bow, but more often than not, you're working with legato lines where everything is smooth and connected note by note. So to imitate that legato sound, what you wanna be able to do is keep all of these notes overlapped just slightly, but not so much that it sounds like they're bleeding into each other. Here's what would happen if it was bleeding too much into each other. So I'm connecting the notes too much. Obviously way too exaggerated. Here's what would happen if they weren't connected enough. More like of a tenuto sound or staccato even. So we want something right in between. Now, in key commands, I have a custom one for this, but if you type force legato, you should have a shortcut here indicated by the key over here. There's two different ones. There's one to trim the note ends, and there's trim notes to selected. Both of them are very similar, so you can play and see which one works for your needs. I like to use typically trim note to selected, just because I select what I want to use. So whatever that key command is for you, mine is shift backslash, which I like to use. Highlight all of the notes, use your force legato shortcut, and you'll notice now they're all connected. Now, if you have one note that goes all the way to the end, just don't select that note when you're doing this shortcut. You can select all of these notes and it should work just fine. Now you'll hear everything is nice and connected. Depending on your VST, you might still find that they're very short sounding. Let's see with this one. So we're still having a little bit of ta ta ta, so we need a little bit of overlap. So let's highlight them all again. Go to the note end at the very end and you'll get a little trim icon. This looks like this. Drag very slightly. Now, if you're having a hard time and it's kind of snapping to each thing, you can hold Control after you click, and you can drag without having that snap. So I'm gonna drag just slightly to get a little bit of overlap, and let's see how that sounds. Pretty good. Let's do just a little bit more. I think that sounds great. It's just enough that we're getting the notes connected and not so much that we're hearing that bleed note to note. So the last quick thing you can do to kind of enhance the realism of cheaper or free VSTs is to use a little bit of reverb. Now, sometimes when people think of reverb, they think of it as just a special effect to make things sound cool, but it's actually a really important tool for realism. If you were at a concert or a stadium and you heard a performance, you're not gonna hear the performance like it's right in front of you. You're actually hearing the room or the environment that you're in influencing the sound that you hear. That's in part what can make a production sound realistic. When we think of orchestral instruments, we think of an orchestra, we think of a large group of people, and we couldn't have them performing in a space that's so small that there's no reverb. Now take a listen to this recording again, close your eyes, and try and picture what size of a room this is being played in. Not a very big room, right? If it was a big room, we'd hear a lot more reverb. So let's make it sound like it's actually in a room instead of in our ears. Now you'll notice that on our track, we already have a reverb here, Space Designer. It's a great Logic stock reverb, but there's a problem. When we have our reverb on our track and we've done track automation with volume, we're actually influencing everything on that track, including the plugins. So no matter how long our reverb is, if we cut the volume down to 0, we're gonna lose all the reverb. I'll demonstrate that right here. So suddenly all the reverb goes away because we've turned the volume off to 0. So a better way to use reverb is instead of putting it directly on the track, we're gonna add a send. Now if we go to our buses, we're gonna make a bus, and a bus is essentially sending some of the volume of our track over to a new plugin. So when we click on the bus, you'll see on the right side, we've got what says aux1, and that's basically just a track that's gonna host some plugins for us. So on aux1, we're gonna go and we're gonna add our reverb. I'm gonna go and add Space Designer for a default setting. Now, we're not gonna hear anything yet because we haven't told our track how much to send to this reverb. That's where our bus comes in handy. We have bus 1. Right here, we've got a little dial. I'm gonna click here and just drag that upwards. Now, the more I drag upwards, the more of the signal I'm sending to the bus. You can think like a bus carries people, this bus carries volume. So we're saying, I want a lot of volume to go over to this plugin here. Now let's give it a listen and see what happens when we drag this up and down. Now we're still getting our reverb even though the track volume has gone down to 0 because our bus volume has not been affected. This is also really useful because if you have a lot of tracks, let's say we had a lot of violin tracks like this, we could just go in our mixer, instead of adding 1 reverb per track, go in our mixer, highlight them all, and if it's not already set, we could just add bus 1 and choose our different amounts. So we can send all of these tracks to 1 reverb, just like we'd have all of the instruments in 1 room. Now, the other really important thing with reverb to consider is the size of your room. The bigger a room you're gonna have, generally the more reverb you'd have. So here we've got a length of 1.3 seconds. And if we listen, when we go to the end of a note, you'll hear it'll take about 1.3 seconds to decay. Okay, let's say we wanted that to be a little bit larger. Now, it would be larger if we were going for a kind of broader, more epic, grandiose sound. That's not always what you want, but let's say that's what we were going for. We could go click up here for the stock settings, go to large spaces. Let's go over to halls and let's pick long reverb. Now you'll see we've got a length of 3.02 seconds, so it should take a little longer for that sound to go away. See, it's a bit more of a gradual decay. Then the other thing we would do, of course, is just play with how much we're sending to the reverb. So if you want it to feel deeper in the hall or the room, you add more of the bus or the send. If you want it to sound a little closer, you add less. You can keep the length the same because the room is the same size, but that feeling of closeness or distance that you're gonna get is influenced by how much you're sending to the reverb. So again, to demonstrate, this is a closer sound, and then farther. When it comes to vocals, the way that I'll approach this is I'll have the lead vocal very dry and up front, and then I'll have the background vocals a little bit more sent to a reverb so it sounds a little bit farther back. You could do the same thing with an orchestra. I would recommend you check out an orchestral layout to get an idea of where the instruments are placed in an orchestra. Typically you have strings kind of front and center, you have some of the percussion in the way back, brass is also kind of far back, and the winds are kind of somewhere in the middle. So look at an orchestral layout, play with the settings, see what you like. Let's do one last A-B with the violins. Here is our original sound. And here's what we wound up with. So already a hugely enhanced performance. You could do lots of other things to tweak, but this is a good starting point. And if you can master these fundamentals of programming and mixing with cheap VSTs, you'll certainly see the difference when it comes to investing in more expensive VSTs. That's gonna do it for this video. I'm gonna keep it really concise and brief for this one, but if you have follow-up questions for me about this process, please leave them in the comments, and I might do a part 2 where I go into a little bit more detail talking about how to finesse this even more and take it to the next level. If you enjoyed this, again, please do me a huge favor and leave a like. It really helps me out. And if you want to support me on Patreon, I have monthly hangouts with all of my patrons, as well as a couple of extra goodies for those of you who can support me there. So I really appreciate my patrons. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for next week's video, and until then, thanks again for watching.